The Master of Hestviken by Sigrid Undset. Translated from the Norwegian by Arthur G. Chater. Book 4. The Sun Avenger. Part 1. Winter. Chapter 1. One evening in late autumn, Olav Audunsson went down to his sheds at the waterside to see that all was made fast and well closed. It had been blowing hard during the day, and the tide was high, and now on the approach of night the wind was rising. Going out upon the pier, he saw that a little sailing boat had put in under its lee. There was only one man in the boat, and so Olaf went up to see if the stranger might need a hand. "Now luck is with me," said the newcomer, shaking the water from his clothes, while Olaf took charge of his arms and wiped the worst of the wet from him. "My wish was to speak with you alone, Olaf, as soon as might be, and here you come yourself to meet me." He talked as if they had known each other of old, and Olaf thought he had seen this young lad before, but could not put a name to him. His face was fair and bold-featured, with a delicate thin-lipped mouth. A little spoilt by the bulging pale blue eyes, but in spite of that he was good-looking. The hair clung to his forehead under the waxed linen hat from which the water poured, but it could be seen that it had a reddish tinge. The stranger was tall and well-grown. Olaf took the man into one of the sheds and bade him declare his errand. "Yes, it is best I say how it is, master. I have had the mischance to slay a man, and no atonement has yet been made. The case may drag on. And so I could think of no better way than to put myself in your hands. I know you for a man who will not refuse to hide me, while my kinsmen make terms on my behalf." Olaf was silent. It had become a far more risky matter to harbour outlaws of late years, since the country had grown quieter and King Hakon enforced the laws more strictly. But on the other hand, he could not send the young man away. The fjord was white with foam, and night was already falling. "Where did this thing happen?" he asked. "And what manner of man was it that you slew?" "It was at home, and the man was Hallvard Bratt, the warden's nephew." "At home? Where may that be?" asked Olaf, rather impatiently. "I see that you do not know me," said the young man, seeming hurt. "Although I was with you as your trusty comrade both in the fight by Skeda's church and at Frisia Bridge." "Ah, yes, now I remember. Now I remember where I have seen you before. Aslak Gunnarsson from Itterdal. But you have grown much since that time, Aslak. 'Tis nigh 4 years ago." Aslak went on with his tale. The way of it was that Aslak's father had given summer pasturage to some cows for the Lady Signa, Hallvard Bratt's sister, and 2 of these had been struck down by the bear. When the dalesman came back to Hamar with the lady's cattle, she had been very unreasonable, and so one word had led to another. At last Hallvard, the lady's brother, who was standing by, had uttered words of Gunnar of Itterdal, to which Aslak could not listen with patience. He had got away after the slaying, had ridden south, and first sought refuge with the White Friars at Tunsberg. But on coming to the convent he learnt that his kinsman, Prior Sigurd, was lately dead, and he quickly guessed that the monks were loath to give him shelter. They had been compelled to abandon their claim that the right of asylum enjoyed by the convent of Mariskog also applied to the house of their order at Tunsberg. The abbot said he might indeed repair to Mariskog, but it was becoming somewhat too common for King Hakon's enemies to take sanctuary there, and Aslak had remarked that the monks were a little uneasy since the king no longer looked with favour upon this monastery which possessed the right of asylum. That being so, Aslak had no great mind to betake himself thither. And then I thought of you, Olav. A man without fear I know you to be, and one that is wont to do as he thinks fit. You yourself have roamed as an outlaw in your youth, so I thought you would not refuse me help. Olaf was not more favourably disposed to hide the manslayer by what he had just heard. That the lad was from the uplands and seemed to know more about Olaf's youth in that part of the country than Olaf cared to be reminded of. How much it was not easy to guess. Until now he had believed that folk in the north had long forgotten him and his affairs. It was so many years since he had shown himself in those regions. Eirik had been there a while 2 years ago, and had visited Steinfinn Håkonsson at Berg. Olaf had not been pleased when he heard of it. Nor did he grieve over much when it came to his ears that the cousins had fallen out a few months later, so that Eirik had not stayed long in the uplands. But as for refusing to receive Aslak Gunnarsson, there could be no question of that. So he said they had better go up to the houses. Aslak must need some warm food and dry clothes. At any rate, thought Olaf, as he helped to carry the others' gear, it was a lucky thing that nobody at home would try to ferret out who their guest was. Since Lady Marta's death in the spring, Botild Askersdatter and Cecilia managed his house, and the 2 young maids were so well brought up that they never troubled their father with unnecessary questions. Aslak Gunnarsson settled down at Hestviken. It had not been Olaf's intention that he should remain there, but he could not bring himself to say anything about the matter, and when spring came Aslak was still there, bearing himself in every way as if he belonged to the household. They called him John Torreson. It was Olaf who hit upon this name, from which no one could guess who he was. Otherwise Olaf was quite willing to admit that Aslak, or John, was a most agreeable housemate, and he had a way of making himself useful. He was strong and industrious, incredibly handy besides, an excellent worker both in wood and iron, and he always found something to occupy him. Olaf himself had never been more than a moderately skilful craftsman. He could accomplish all that was needed about the farm, but not such things as required special cunning or deftness of hand and a delicate eye. And since he lost Bodvar, the housecarl who fell at Frisia Bridge, he had not had a man who was practised in such crafts. And then Aslak was always cheerful and of good humour. He had a fine voice for singing, but above all he could whistle so sweetly and truly that it was a pleasure to hear him. He almost always whistled at his work. He could read a little too, so Olaf got him to look at some of the writings he had concerning his estates and privileges. There were 1 or 2 matters as to which he could not trust his memory. Withal, Aslak was quiet in his ways, so that he did not too roughly disturb the muffled tone which prevailed at Hestviken. Life at the manor was calm and still. Little was said among the household, and all spoke low. The master's silence lay like a damper upon all these people who had lived with him so long. They were for the most part the same. Nevertheless, the life of Hestviken seemed to have taken on a brighter hue since Marta Bigsdatter's sharp voice was hushed and her keen eyes closed. The 2 young foster sisters, who now shared the duties of housewife between them, were the most demure and courteous maids a man could see. Yet there was a youthful joy and brightness about them. They were so fair and so well beloved of everyone. Botild Askersdatter was now in her 18th year, quick and capable beyond her age, and not strong in health, blithe and gentle at home, but very shy among strangers. As to Cecilia Olafsdatter, no one ever thought of putting it down to bashfulness or timidity that she was so retiring in folks' company. She looked everyone straight in the face with her clear, cool, pale grey eyes. Olaf's young daughter was as taciturn as her father, and just as fair-skinned as he had been in his youth. The shining flaxen hair lay in soft curls about the girl's head when she wore it loose on holy days. Her complexion was white as the kernel of a nut, and her skin seemed so firm and close that sun and wind made little impression on it, and the full young lips were pink as the pale briar rose. She was short for her 15 years, and rather broadly built, but round and shapely, with small hands and feet, but strong of hand and sure of foot. It was rarely that Cecilia Olafsdatter smiled, and her laugh was rarer yet. But then she had never been heard to weep. In her actions she was kind with her own people and charitable to the poor and sick, but rather sullen and short-spoken in her manner. The foster sisters were always good friends, and of one mind. They seemed to be bound together in intimate affection. The Hestvik maids were never abroad, except to the annual feastings within Olaf's own circle of friends. Otherwise they were not to be seen at such meetings as were frequented by young people, but they went to Mass every Sunday and holy day, unless the weather was very bad. And then they were so handsomely dressed and adorned that no other woman had better clothes or heavier silver belts and buckles than Olaf's maids. Both were called so among the folk, and they rode, one on each side of their father, on good, well-groomed horses, with newly clipped hog manes. Olaf's heart was filled with deep and silent joy as he walked up the church with his daughters. Their coloured mantles of foreign cloth trailed after them. Through the thin veils shimmered the maiden's unbound hair, bottled smooth and copper-brown, Cecilia's silky mane bright as silver. He stood during the Mass and never once looked over to the women's side. Nevertheless, it was as though all his thoughts were centred on their presence in that place. He no longer thought of himself and his own affairs. He was now an old man, it seemed to him, had made his choices of what was to become of him. But for that very reason, all that he might yet achieve ere evening fell upon him had but one object, to brighten the lives of these two children. How their future would shape itself, of this he scarcely thought. It would surely fall out for the best. In course of time he would marry them off, and it would be a strange man indeed who would not bear such treasures safely through the world, when once he had had the good fortune to win them. But still he had time enough to look about him. They were yet so very young, both of them. There was Eirik. But it was as though the figure of Eirik had faded into unreality in Olaf's mind. He seldom gave him a thought. He had not seen him since that day in Oslo. Olaf had been away from home, the only time Eirik had visited Hestviken since. It would be 4 years ago this summer. And then his father had gone with Ivar Johnson on the campaign in Sweden, where that brave young leader fell. And it had grown almost to a certainty in Olaf's mind that Eirik would never possess Hestviken after him. That sin God had taken from him. The false heir was not to take over the old manor. God himself would defend Cecilia's rights. Then there came a morning in early summer. Olaf and one of his men were down on the beach by the pier, busy hanging up some nets. The weather was as fine as could be. The sunlight lay in great white flakes upon the sea. Around the bay, fields and meadows shone with a wealth of green, and the leaves of the alders were dark already with their summer hue, while the firs had long, fresh shoots. Cecilia knelt on the sun-baked rock by the pier, with a heap of bright, floundering fish beside her. In the morning sun, the girl's old, rusty-brown, everyday frock was quite resplendent. Her thick, fair plaits hung over her shoulders. They were not very long, and her hair was so curly that the plaits escaped from the red ribbons that bound them. Her knife flashed as she raised it and tried the edge against her finger. It gave a sound of summer and mild weather in the morning stillness as Aslak loaded his boat. The water splashed and gurgled as he moved about and arranged the goods he was to take with him. Olaf had sent him on an errand south to Saltviken. "John," called Cecilia softly. The man looked up. Olaf saw his healthy young face light up in a quiet smile. As the girl beckoned to him with her knife, he drew the boat up to her along the edge of the pier. She was now standing on the rock. It was the knife that she wanted him to sharpen for her. She sat down as he did so, looking out across the water with her hands resting in her lap. They were not talking together that Olaf could see, but when he had finished and took his place in the boat again, the same quiet, warm smile played across Aslak's face. And as Cecilia went back to her work, a reflection, as it were, of the same smile lay upon her fair features. She began to clean the fish. As Aslak rowed past the rock, he dropped the oars for a stroke and waved his hand to the maid. And Cecilia raised a hand slightly in reply. Then she bent over her work again with a furtive little smile. Olaf stared. It had given him a shock. Something was passing before his eyes of which he had had no suspicion. Cecilia threw the cleaned fish into the bucket and straightened herself a moment. She turned her lovely white face up toward the sun and sat with closed eyes, and the smile which spread over the child's stubborn little face was like nothing her father had ever seen before. It beamed with a sweet and secret joy. No fairer sight had Olaf ever seen in his life. Afterwards he tried to shake it off. Go and take a fancy to a man who lived here at Hestviken as a servant? No, his daughter could never do that. She could not even have known who this John Torresson was. Nevertheless, Olaf determined to be rid of Aslak as soon as might be. The lad was now free to remain in the country. During the past winter he had received news through the monks of Tunsberg that the ban of outlawry had been removed. So now there was no reason for Olaf's keeping him longer than he had use for his services. But a week went by before Olaf found occasion to broach the matter to Aslak. Covertly he kept an eye on the two young people, but he could see no sign that they were closer friends with each other than with the rest of the household. He comforted himself with the thought that he had been mistaken that morning by the pier. Until the Saturday evening, when Olaf and the men were to go to the bathhouse, but the women would wash themselves in the cookhouse. They had been preparing juniper water. Olaf and the men were crossing the yard when Cecilia called to Aslak from the cookhouse door. It struck her father that she knew their guest's real name. Aslak went over to the maid, took from her 2 pails, and dashed past Olaf. In the golden afternoon sunshine he ran light-footed down the meadow to the spring. He was a big man, slight and loose of limb, handsome and cheerful. His curly reddish hair shone so gaily in the evening sun. Olaf stood still. Now Cecilia appeared again at the cookhouse door. She had put off her kirtle and stood in her blue undergarment, which fell about her in rich folds down to her little bare feet, as she stood warming one with the other, for the stone was cold in the shadow. While waiting for the water, she let down her plaits, shook out her hair and combed it so that it waved about her face and arms. Aslak came up with the pails of water. The two young people exchanged a few words which Olaf could not hear, but again Cecilia's face beamed with that new and lovely light. And Aslak was smiling as he left her. On Monday evening Olaf went out to the smithy and spoke to Aslak. "Your mind will be set toward home, Aslak, now that your atonement is made, and I think perchance you would do well to profit by the fine weather while it lasts. You reckon it a 4 days' journey, do you not?" Aslak laid down what he had in his hands and looked at the older man. "I have thought the same myself, Olav, that I would go home before long. If I shall not be leaving you in the lurch, will you then let me go before the haymaking?" "You may be sure that I will. It is not my wish that you stay here as my serving man, now that you no longer need my harbouring." "No," said Aslak, "I am not that sort of man either. You know well that I will stay as long as you have use for me." Olaf shook his head. Aslak removed some scythe blades he had been sharpening. He seemed somewhat agitated. Then he turned and faced Olaf. He had a serious look. The fellow was handsome. His bold-featured, ruddy face was frank and honest. It was remarkable how little it was spoilt by the prominent eyes. "If I were to come back, Olaf, so soon as my father or my eldest brother can make ready to accompany me south, can you guess what it is I would have my kinsman ask of you?" Olaf made no reply. Aslak went on. "Perhaps you can guess what our business would be with you? How would you receive us, and what answer might my father expect of you?" "If your meaning is what I believe it to be," said Olaf very low and indistinctly, "then I will tell you. Do not trouble your kinsman to make the long journey for nothing." Aslak gave a little start. "Can you say that so surely, Olaf, before you have heard what conditions we would offer you? It is true, you might find a richer son-in-law, but you might also find a poorer. And the richest men are seldom those of best birth or repute, as times are now, unless you should look for them among those knights and nobles with whom you yourself have not cared to associate in all the time you have dwelt here at Hestviken. I come of such good kin, so old in all its branches, that I may claim on that score to be a match for your daughter, and there are not many men in Heidmark who enjoy such honour as my father." Olaf shrugged his shoulders slightly. He could not find an answer to this offhand. It was not quite clear to his mind why he would not at any price marry Cecilia to a man from the uplands. "There is this too," said Aslak again. "It may be a good enough thing to marry one's child to wealth, but this avails little if the son-in-law be such a one as doesn't know how to husband his estate and improve his position. I think I may promise you this. In my hands it will not decrease, if God do grant me health and save us from great misfortunes. I have been with you more than half a year. You know me. I say nothing else but that I like you, Aslak, but that is not reason enough for giving away one's only daughter to the first man who asks for her. I know little more of you than that you have many brothers and sisters, and you yourself have said that Gunnar's lot is not an easy one, though, indeed, I have never heard anything but good of your house, the little I have heard of it. But it is another matter that, young as you are, you have already been the death of a man, and it was as an outlaw you came hither to me." Olaf felt a strange relief in every reason he found for refusing the lad. "Moreover, it seems to me you are far too young to think of marriage without having asked the advice of your kinfolk." "I have repented and atoned for my sin," said Aslak. And as to my having slain a man so early in life, that surely is the more reason for thinking I have learnt to command myself better, so that I shall not fall into the like another time, unless I be strongly provoked. But you should be the last man to blame me for that, Olav Audunsson. Nor can you rightly think me too young to seek a bride, for I am full 19 years old. You were 15 or 16, I have heard, when you took a wife by force, and cut down her cousin who sought to deny her to you. The one case is not like the other, Aslak. Olav succeeded in speaking quite coolly. The maid whom I took to myself was affianced to me, and I to her. There was a legally binding act between her father and my father while we were yet of tender age, and afterwards her kinsman tried to set at nothing the rights of us two fatherless children. You will lose neither honour nor rights if you fail to win the first young maid you have cast your eyes upon, without your kinsman so much as knowing what you have in mind. No, said Olav hotly. Your father shall never have leave to say of me that I received you when you came hither, a friendless outlaw, and then treated with you, a young lad under age, for the hand of my daughter, without even knowing whether your kinsfolk were minded to ally themselves with my house. You know yourself, replied Aslak coolly. 'Tis not likely my father would be loath to see me wed the daughter of Olav Audunsson of Hestviken. I don't know what you mean. Is it on account of those rumours that were abroad concerning you at the time when your marriage with Ingunn Steinfinnsons' daughter was at issue? So much water has flowed into the fjord since then that no man cares any more what you did or left undone in your young days. For since that time you have lived peaceably for more than 20 years, and have won renown for honourable conduct, both in peace and war. Olav felt his heart beating with terrible force, but he broke off, cold as ice. That is well and good, Aslak, but it is vain for you to say more on this subject. For Cecilia I have other designs. Of that she knows nothing, exclaimed Aslak hotly. Is it so? Olav felt relieved at being given just cause for breaking out in anger. That you have made bold to woo my daughter behind my back? You surely do not believe that of me. Not one word have I spoken to Cecilia with which you could have found fault. But that I like her, she has seen, and I have seen that she likes me. Neither of us can help that. Such things cannot be hid. If you would listen to us, Olaf, Cecilia would give her consent without sorrow. So much I have guessed. Olaf said, Nor will it bring so much sorrow upon either of you if I refuse to listen to your suit. The maid is but a child, and you are not so old either. Do you say so? You yourself and her mother held fast to each other for 10 years or more, and would not suffer her kinsman to part the love that was between you. I have heard you spoken of at home, Olaf, as patterns of loyalty in love. Olaf was silent a moment. The boy's words went strangely to his heart, while at the same time he was yet more unshakably determined that he would never have Cecilia married to a man from that part of the country. Then he replied in a low and faltering voice, That was different, Aslak. I had a right to her. And we had grown up together like two berries on a twig, loved each other as brother and sister from early childhood. You two, Cecilia and you, have known each other for what? 1 winter, and there is no compact between you. So it cannot be so great a grief to either of you if you now must part. Aslak flushed deeply. He stood for a moment with bowed head, his hand on his breast, his fingers plucking at his brooch. "For your daughter I cannot answer," he then said shortly. "I—" He shrugged his shoulders, then turned on his heel and went out. Next day he was already prepared for the road. He took it with a good grace, thanked Olav in well-chosen words for the help and friendship he had shown, and bade him farewell. He went round and took leave of all his fellows. Privily Olav kept an anxious watch on the two young people when they said farewell to one another. But they took it well. They did not look at each other, and their hands dropped with a strange slackness after they had joined them. Otherwise there was no sign for one who did not know. Then Aslak rode away from Hestviken. Olav continually watched his daughter in secret, but Cecilia was like her usual self, and her father tried to make himself believe that she did not regret Aslak, not much in any case. And she was only 15. 15 had been Ingunn's age, but that was different altogether. He had nothing to regret. The youngest son from Ytterdal, Cecilia Olavsdatter of Hestviken, might well look for a better match than that. It was natural that she should like Aslak. She had seen so few young men, and the boy had winning ways. But she would forget him sure enough when she met others. It had made a stir in Olaf's mind, an insufferable welter of conflicting emotions, to find that there were still folk in the north who remembered his and Ingunn's love and talked about it. As a pattern. And rumours. He didn't know what sort of rumours they might be. He had believed them both forgotten in those parts, both himself and her. Here no one remembered Ingunn save himself alone, and he no longer remembered her so well that he thought of her often. It was only that he knew of all that had happened, that he was aware of the origin of everything that had befallen him. Sin and sorrow and shame, and beneath it all the memories of a sweetness which might well up as water wells up over the ice, and flood his whole soul whenever a break was made in the crust of his peace of mind. And there in the north, all this lived among folk as a legend, true or false. Not for anything in the world would he resume fellowship with men who perhaps talked behind his back of his youth's adventures. And this merely for a young maid's fancy, which she would surely have forgotten before a year was out, if only no one reminded her of it. Was he to return alive to such a purgatory for the sake of two children's childishness? Never would he consent.